Ladies and gentlemen, this is Michael Fazio depicting the many different various forms of gods that appear upon the obverse and reverse of the $1 bill. And in this instance, what you are looking at is a profile of Tutankhamun. And underneath the profile of Tutankhamun is an identical structure of a face. And it is placed here because whoever created the $1 bill placed pictures of the Egyptian gods all throughout the many different pictographs that appear on the obverse and reverse of the $1 bill. And I can tell you right now that there are 3,300. Ladies and gentlemen, what you see above the headdress is what is called the vulture's headdress. Above the brow, the vulture's headdress. What you see at the chin of Tutankhamun is called the pilated false beard. And this pilated false beard is represented by this pink line that runs around the back or bottom of the evil seed of death. More importantly, these appear as opposites, as guards or guardian type entities that are represented in the book of Exodus 25:19, because whoever placed these Egyptian gods upon the $1 bill did so utilizing geometry, but more specifically Euclidean optics. And the way that I discovered this was, well, it was through a state of enlightenment to some degree, that I knew something was going on. This particular aspect of the end, on either end of the $1 bill, is called a dais, or a porch-like structure, which I can tell you unequivocally is in fact a porch. It is the porch of King Solomon's temple. And the entire green side of the $1 bill, every aspect of it is in fact a one-dimensional point of view of King Solomon's temple that can be transferred into a three-dimensional point of view if you have the understanding and the knowledge of Euclidean optics and the ability to see in a three-dimensional plane, which it took me 20 years for myself to believe what I have found out about the 3,300 pictographs that appear on the obverse and reverse of the $1 bill. And I did this, of course, by playing Dick Tracy. And in the course of playing Dick Tracy, this is one of the things that I found. I found that the entire green side of the $1 bill is an exact replica to scale of the Ark of the Covenant that was given unto Moses by the Lord God on the Sermon on the Mount. However, as impossible as this sounds, whatever gave the instructions to the Lord God to create the Ark of the Covenant was the same entity that gave the instructions to the Egyptians that built the Great Pyramid. This is an almost impossible concept to move your head around, and yet in order to understand why there are 3,300 pictographs and how these 3,300 pictographs and the ones that are the most important are discussed in the words of the Living Bible that was written 3,000 to 7,000 years before the Ark of the Covenant and the time of the creation of the $1 bill. In the case of the Ark of the Covenant, it is 3,314 years from present day and 7,000 years since the beginning of the Bible, and perhaps 4,000 years since the creation of the Great Pyramid. However, the objects that appear on the $1 bill and the words in the Living Bible are a codex between the objects on the $1 bill and the Living Bible. This is a representation of the God pod. Everything inside the God pod represents life. And in fact, the first 17 verses of Genesis are represented as the central portion of the God pod. Okay, now I call it the God pod because everything inside the God pod represents life. And to prove that the Lord God has chosen to represent itself as the God of all the things in the universe, or the one God, or the living God, it is very specifically pointed itself out in God Trust One. However, to normal man or human beings, on the reverse of the $1 bill exists two different forms of God. One is the yin and the yang, yin of the yang, representing good, and the other God represents evil. As I said, the God pod only has things within the God pod that represents life. However, nothing inside the evil seed of death can represent anything but death. And to prove my point, I have gone into great detail in my book, Angels on the Ark, that in fact, every aspect of the evil seed of death only represents death. What you are looking at the top of the eagle's head is a nuclear detonation. Note, you can see the different particles expanding outwards like a detonation. However, over the apex of the Great Pyramid, around the eye of the Lord God, this is a radiant type of light, which is a glory. So a glory, which is light that comes from the sun, gives life. However, a nuclear detonation destroys life. When you turn the bill upside down, you can see Satan. Satan is represented as an Indian with a bow and arrows, hiding behind the Great Shield of the United States of America with a nuclear detonation underneath his person, because, as I described in my book, there would be 2 nuclear catastrophes on President Obama's watch. I published my book on April 15th of 2010. Thus far, we have had 3 nuclear catastrophes in the form of Fukushima. So in fact, that prediction has already come to fruition. However, there might be another one. So what you have here is the evil seed of death depicting an Indian or chief of the Indian nation with a bow and arrows, which consummates war. And what you have here, when you reverse it, is the President of the United States, who has now involved us in 4 different wars. And just today they decided that they want to try to repeal these wars, as if they should have done so 90 days ago, but all of these ridiculous factions have taken precedence over our Constitution. Either way, this represents the 44th POTUS, and this represents a nuclear detonation, and this represents Satan inside the evil seed of death, because nothing inside the evil seed of death represents life. And this is what the world is coming to. We are in the process of 4 different wars. We have how many various battles that they're not even telling us about, and how many hundreds of thousands of pounds of munitions with depleted uranium are contaminating the entire surface of the globe from the dust once these projectiles are shot from their breaches. Ladies and gentlemen, we are entering into a period in history where if we don't start to understand what's going on inside the 3,300 pictographs on the $1 bill, in that there is in fact a God, and He has given us a choice over good and evil. If we don't start to get this right, the world as we know it will come to an end before December 15th of 2012. And by December 15th of 2011, every law will have been placed into the history books to destroy the Constitution of the United States of America. And in my opinion, Michelle Bachmann, when she announced her presidency, she also on the same day announced her love for Israel. On that day, she said she was going to run for office, although it wasn't official. The same day she said she was going to run for office, she announced her love for Israel. And the same day, the papers plastered it all over the papers as a headline, Michelle Bachmann's love for Israel. However, since that day, she has recanted and says she loves Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Michael Fazio with my political opinion and the pictographs that appear on the obverse of the $1 bill saying God day to you from the Florida Keys.